The Happy Days Diner was no doubt intended to look as if it had been built in the 50s, but was clearly counterfeit. Molded plastic panels replaced the stainless steel of a traditional diner. LEDs replaced neon. Inside, with a little more than a week to go before Christmas, every free inch of floor space was jammed with holiday kitsch. Artificial trees sprouting metallic silver needles, illuminated snowmen next to plastic crush scenes. The few patrons were talking loudly to be heard over a swing version of Jingle Bells. Lizzie opened the menu. It was huge, multiple laminated pages with everything from steaks to pancakes to shrimp cocktail. She glanced around at the other patrons, who all seemed to be eating burgers. She remembered her mother saying once to her father, when the three of them still sometimes went out for dinner, that you should only order seafood at places where they had a lot of turnover, because then you could count on it being fresh. Lizzie had been pretty little at the time and didn't have a chance to ask what turnover was before the conversation moved on to other topics. She had seen a fish flop around on the bottom of a boat once time when her dad had taken her fishing at Mauchunk Lake. That fish had certainly turned itself over. She smiled at the memory and then swallowed back a sudden sob as she thought back to that fishing trip and the photo from it that her mother had kept stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet until she died and the photo had been packed up for the move to Parksburg. In the picture, Lizzie was proudly holding two fish she had caught and was wearing a baseball hat of her dad's, the two big caps sitting low so she had to tilt her head back to see the camera. She didn't notice that the waitress had returned to her booth, her pencil poised over her order pad. Decide what you want? At that moment, the father of the family group at the table across the aisle said, "Hey, could we get our check?" "I'll be with you in 1 minute," said the waitress, "just as soon as I get this girl's order." She looked at Lizzie, her eyebrows raised expectantly, her mouth a thin line. "I don't know yet," said Lizzie. "Maybe you could take care of them first." She felt her heart begin to pound, and she took several fast breaths until she realized she was risking hyperventilating. "See," said the father, "she doesn't mind if you get us our check." He turned to Lizzie. "Right, honey?" He said honey in a way that made his wife, who was dealing with an imminent meltdown by a toddler strapped into a high chair, shoot him a dirty look. The waitress turned toward the family's table, and Lizzie sensed it was not to rush off to get their check. She slid out of the booth. "I don't see anything I want. Sorry," she said. She grabbed her purse and coat and headed for the door. When she got there, she glanced back and just caught the waitress say, as she turned toward the family at the booth, "Doesn't see anything she wants," in a whiny imitation of Lizzie's voice, followed by the father's over-loud laugh. So Lizzie leaves the Happy Days Diner, first obtaining a book that she needs for a book swap shelf at her regular restaurant, Glick's. Glick's was filled with senior citizens. All the women seemed to be wearing Christmas-themed sweatshirts, and one of the men wore a reindeer antler hat. The noise level wasn't much less than it had been at the Happy Days Diner, but it was a cheerful buzz, friendly chatter punctuated by laughter. Lizzie saw Christine hustling from table to table, a water pitcher in one hand and a coffee carafe in the other. There was one table open, one that was in Christine's normal area. Maybe her luck was turning. Lizzie sat down and pulled out the book she had gotten. A Roll in the Hay, an Amish romance. The cover showed a pretty young woman in an oddly form-fitting dress, a white cap having been apparently photoshopped onto her head. In the background, in front of what Lizzie guessed was a stock picture of a tidy-looking barn, stood a handsome young man leaning on a pitchfork, in his white shirt unbuttoned to his navel. She giggled. She sensed someone standing next to her and looked up, still smiling, ready to show Christine the funny cover. But the woman standing by her table was the older waitress, Dee, her pencil poised over her order pad. "What would you like, hon?" "Isn't this Christine's table?" Lizzie blurted out. "She's working the register now," said Dee. Lizzie looked toward the front of the restaurant and saw Christine dealing with a line that had formed as the people from the bus began finishing up their meals and filing out. Much to her horror, Lizzie began to feel tears well up. "I'll have a piece of pumpkin pie and tea to go." She didn't want a whole lunch anymore, and she also didn't feel like replaying the incident at the Happy Days Diner by getting up and leaving. "Sure thing," said Dee, looking at her with some concern before she hurried away. Lizzie sat forward as if she was reading the ridiculous book, pulling her hair out of its ponytail to let it fall forward to hide her face. She thought she could get it under control, but her thoughts were a jumble. The inauthenticity of the Happy Days Diner, the too loud music, the tacky decorations, the rude waitress, the creepy guy at the next booth, and hardest of all, the treachery of that happy memory of eating dinner out with her parents and fishing with her dad, ruined by everything that had happened since then. She had hoped to put all that behind her for just a few minutes by laughing over a silly book with Christine, who, as pathetic as it sounded, was the only person other than Uncle Owen that she thought of as a friend. Her throat clamped shut, and she brushed tears away behind the curtain of her hair. Dee was back in a minute with a styrofoam takeaway container and cup. It's going to be $4.50. Want me to take your money up to the register for you? Save you having to stand in line. Yeah, that would be great, thanks, said Lizzie. She gave Dee a $5, and she was back in a minute with Lizzie's change. Lizzie realized she didn't have any singles, but she didn't want to have to ask for change. She dropped another $5 on the table. This was turning out to be an expensive lunch for just pie, tea, and a crappy book. Suddenly exhausted, she struggled into her coat. She headed for the door, turning away from the counter and Christine, who was ringing up the last of the departing bus crowd. Hey, it's the bookworm, Lizzie heard, and turned toward the counter where Christine stood. Christine grinned at her and then noticed Lizzie's reddened eyes. You okay? Lizzie nodded. Yeah, I just suddenly didn't feel good. Probably just need some fresh air. Sure, probably. Christine beckoned her over to the counter. Is it your stomach? Lizzie, regretting that she had used the illness excuse, nodded. You know what's good for that, said Christine? Flat ginger ale. Hold on. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned a minute later with a can of Canada Dry. Let it sit open for a while until it gets flat. It works better. She handed the can to Lizzie. Thanks, said Lizzie, fumbling for her wallet. Christine waved her hand. Don't worry about it. I'll just add it to your tab next time you're in. I hope you feel better. Thanks, said Lizzie, and turned from the counter. Then she turned back. Hey, I got a book. She held it up. Christine looked at it and laughed. Well, it's not what I would have recommended, but when you're done with that one, stop back and you can swap it for another one. I know which the good ones are. The bell rang merrily as Lizzie pushed the door open and stepped into the blustery December day, a foolish smile on her face.